the 2 cents, right? Antibody testing is not done to confirm an active disease or an active virus, but it's done to show confirmation of exposure to a previous virus. You know what I mean? Like if you have antibodies to, it's like a titer. If you have antibodies to strep, it doesn't mean you have strep throat,
Right.
but it means you've had strep throat. So it's not a test to confirm you have, if you run an ASO titer, it doesn't mean you have active strep throat. It means you have antibodies.
Right.
And we need to talk about what that means. I'm going at it right after this. I'm going at it with the Pennsylvania Department of Health. So, because they're like, there's no antibody testing. Like, bullshit. It's on the fucking FDA website. There's 13 tests doing it.
All right. Hey, what's up, Chris?
How you doing, Steve? Good
All
to see you.
good. All is good. All right. So Dr. Chris Turnpaugh, we were just talking a little bit about some of the work you've been doing during this COVID crisis. In your office, you were able to get some kits to do some serum testing for antibodies.
Correct.
Bring our audience up to speed on what that even means and why you would do that in your practice.
Okay, great question. So the antibody testing, a lot of controversy about it. I've heard a lot of people, even at the high level government level, saying there's no antibody testing, there's no antibody testing. First of all, there is antibody testing. So what an antibody is it is your immune system's ability to recognize a pathogen or an invader in your body so it can memorize it, tag it, and have more efficient destruction of it. So when you have an antibody to a virus or a bug or a bacteria, you become much more efficient at it. And then you also will develop a titer or immunity to that bug for the amount of time that you have the antibody. So I laid the groundwork there. So antibodies look like an upside down Y, but when I teach, this is my antibody because it goes out and attacks things. So if you have an antibody to a bug, it makes it more efficient at attacking that bug. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't attack other bugs. It only is specific to one bug. So we have antibody testing to COVID-19. There are 13 companies on the FDA's website that do antibody testing for COVID-19. Now, they're used in what's called an EUA, or emergency use authorization. And the reason for that is we don't have a 3-year retrospective study on studying antibodies to COVID-19 because we haven't even known about this thing for 3 years. So we don't have that ability to recognize what this means. What we do have is the antibody. So think of the bug, the virus, and we look at little pieces of it. And every piece of the bug you can develop an antibody to. So you don't develop an antibody to the entire bug, you develop it to a piece of the bug. Now you might have a little piece of that bug and you develop an antibody to that. And then the next piece you develop an antibody to, the next piece you develop an antibody to. So the more antibodies that you find positive to the bug, the more likely it is you can attack that entire bug. The reason that that is important is this little piece of COVID-19, although it is on COVID-19, may also be on a common cold. So they're both coronaviruses. So you can get this piece that exists on both bugs. So you might have one antibody, but it's not because you saw COVID-19, it's because you saw something that looked a lot like it. So the more pieces of the puzzle, or if we use the puzzle example, one piece of the puzzle might be identical in 2 puzzles, but it's a completely different puzzle. So what we don't know is how many antibodies you need to have to confirm that you have seen the COVID-19 virus. But the antibodies are out there. So there's different tests out. Some are testing 2, some are testing 3. There's one company that's testing 4, hopefully soon to go to 6. So the more antibodies you have, the more likely it is you're going to see or have seen that. Why is this important?
Sorry, Chris. The more different antibodies you have, in other words, the more antibodies you have to the different pieces, or the actual volume of antibodies?
No, the different pieces specific. So not the number as far as volume, the number as far as different ones. So if we're talking about puzzle pieces, the more puzzle pieces, not the identical puzzle piece.
Does volume matter?
Volume matters, but it will in the future. Right now, what matters is a detectable threshold. So we are now looking at that as positive or negative. I think the future will yield levels because I make this antibody army and I might make 1,000 army men to it, right? During a recent attack, I mount up my army against this virus. And over time, the army goes away and you'll keep 1 or 2 army men around. They're called memory B cells. You'll keep them around. A very high titer or a very high antibody load may reflect a recent infection or an unresolved infection. So a volume will matter, but right now the most important thing is, do you have that army to something you've never seen before? So there's really no reason to have 4 antibodies to something you've never seen before. So that would be unique, a unique army. So we're looking for that and trying to figure out those who may have been infected before and resolved.
All right. So now explain why that is even desirable. Why do we want that information?
So well, let me start by saying, because this is where I'm getting in a little bit of hot water with, state health organizations and so forth, is they're saying there's no antibody testing. There is antibody testing. What it means, we're not sure of yet, or what that level means. But why it's important is, if you have 4 individualized antibodies to this COVID-19, that would be extremely unique if you had not seen COVID before. So the only way, not the only way, but the most probable way to get 4 antibodies to COVID-19 would be as if you were infected by COVID-19. And so what we're seeing is people were sick. They weren't tested at all because they didn't meet every single criteria under the sun. So they didn't even test them. So then they resolve. We're not testing youth. We're not testing people that are likely to resolve. We're not testing people if they have every symptom except a fever. So people are being excluded from being tested, and they got really sick and they got better. And they want to know, did they have it? Because if they had it and they got better, they have now developed immunity to it, and they're unlikely to get reinfected for a period of time, which we don't know what that period of time is yet, but for a period of time, they have immunity, which means they got infected, they resolved, they're able to run into COVID and not get infected again.
And that period of time could be a short period of time. It could be forever.
It could be a lifetime.
Right. It could be a lifetime. So, for example, if you had those little memory B cells you were talking about, if I had the chicken pox when I was 7, I got a couple of those running around, making sure that if I see the chicken pox again, that it's targeted. It's like a sniper is there to just isolate that one virus. Okay. Now, when it comes to the antibodies, so my understanding is that if we took 3,000 people in a metropolitan area that have absolutely no symptoms at all, and 50% of them have 4 antibodies, meaning they've seen this thing before, or 2% have 4 antibodies. That's meaningful because we want to make a decision as to whether or not we can go back to work.
Correct.
If 50% have those 4 antibodies, we're closer to this herd immunity idea where the virus kind of stops finding people to infect. But if it's 2%, well then shit, we got a long run of infections to come. Is that correct?
That is correct. And so the question is, who, to this point, who's safe to go back out? Who's safe to re-enter the workforce? Who's safe to go out? Who's safe on the front line? Who's safe? Who has developed immunity? And how many people have been infected? I'm going to digress for a second. I had a patient come in yesterday, and his daughter was in Spain with 4 other girls. They had to come home. She was sick, and one of the other girls was sick. They had to go to mandatory quarantine in a cabin in New Hampshire for 14 days. 2 of them were very sick. One of the girls' fathers worked for the Department of State. So they said, you got to get her tested. So she tested positive for COVID. Okay. Uh, as a young 20-year-old. She was living with these four girls. She was quarantined in the same bedroom with these four girls. So they tested the other three. One had the same exact symptoms. All of the others tested negative to COVID, but they all were exposed to COVID. And the question becomes, how many false negatives do we get with the testing we're doing now, which some are saying is 70% effective and some are saying is 30% effective. So that means we're missing between 30 and 70% of the positives. Let's put that out there. But if we did antibody testing on those four, then it's very likely that we would see all of them have developed immunity to that, and all of them have resolved, and all of them were infected and resolved and are now safe because they have titers or antibodies against this.
All right. So in that situation, that helps us understand who has resolved immunity. They might not, the other kind of testing, they would have to be shedding virus.
Right.
And so if they're not shedding virus and they developed immunity, that test is going to be negative, or they do have it and they are shedding, but the test is a false negative.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So I can't even get a straight answer from the labs. What's the rate of false positives from that? Nobody will give me an answer.
False positives are far worse than false negatives, because false positives will send somebody out into the world feeling safe, and then they might have
false negative. I mean, you're right. You're right. A false positive. Now,
right.
A false negative means you're positive when it shows negative. So a false negative.
A false negative means you're positive when it shows negative, and then
Correct.
You can go hurt people.
Correct.
Or if it's a false positive, you can think you're safe, and then you can hurt yourself. Right?
Right.
So,
yeah.
Now, all right. So these are 4 20-year-olds.
Right.
These
4 20-year-olds, they got it. They resolved. No big deal. They resolved. But they're not going into, they only tested this one girl because her father worked for the Department of State and they required her to be tested. So we can get away from the privilege class conversation, but we can just say, why shouldn't we test anybody who's sick to see how many people are getting this? And if they got it and feel better, we don't even have to do the antibody testing, although we should, to confirm immunity and length of immunity to it. But if you got sick and resolved, the reason you resolved is you developed antibodies to it.
Now, what if you did not get sick and resolved and developed antibodies to it? So the antibody testing really should be the big push for it, again, in the conversation about getting back to work. We need to know in the metropolitan area, the people who have no symptoms, what percentage have antibodies. We should be focusing the antibodies on people who have no symptoms whatsoever, so we can get an idea of how close we are to herd immunity.
Correct. Well, and to that, there's a lot of people that are going to try and tear this argument apart. But let's say Dr. Giannopoulos shows up, never got sick, he has 4 antibodies, and they're going to say, well, that doesn't mean he got the COVID. My argument's going to be, maybe he didn't get COVID-19, but he already has immunity to it for whatever miraculous reason. So maybe he got 4 different viruses in the past, and each one of them yielded a COVID-19 antibody, even though he didn't see COVID-19. He's already got built-in immunity without ever seeing COVID-19. What it means if you have all 4 antibodies is you're protected. I don't care how you got there. If a Martian gave you the antibodies, it doesn't matter. The fact is you're immune and you're able to go forward. And there is some critical thinking that would say maybe some of these antibodies were developed by previous exposure to other viruses that carried similar proteins. So I already have somewhat of an immunity to it without ever seeing it, which is the body's innate brilliance. Like, I'm going to develop an antibody that's going to attack more than the one thing it's designed to. It's going to attack things that are like it.
So similar coronaviruses, just like sometimes you get the flu and it sucks to get the flu, but the good news about getting the flu is you might be immune for the next 4 or 5 years to the different strains that come by.
Different strains, correct, because it was close enough to the one you got that you're good. Yes.
And that's, of course, the argument that's going to be made for the vaccine, that, yeah, this is different, this is different, but get it because it'll protect you from other ones, that type of a thing. But
So
really,
I don't want to go to, I don't want to, that's absolutely ridiculously false, because they micromanage. It's a micromanagement of this one particular piece. I'm convinced they're not going to come up with a vaccine, or if they do, they're going to be lying to us. And I'll tell you why. They didn't come up with one for SARS-1. That was 18 years ago. They're not coming up with, and if they do, you better have some reservation. Why couldn't they come up with one for SARS-1? Why couldn't they come up for MERS? Why couldn't they come up with one for Ebola? Why can't they come up for one for HIV? If they come up with one now, you got to say it's got to be a revolutionary technology, because they couldn't do it for anything like this in the past. And if they can do it for this, they should be able to do one for the common cold. They should be able to do, like, it's ridiculous.
and there's never been a vaccine for a coronavirus,
No.
a commercially available vaccine for a coronavirus. So
No.
beware of because right now what you're seeing is people saying, oh, just get the vaccine already so I can feel safe.
Here's my approach. Get your antibody test. See if you seroconverted, which means you have IgG antibodies. The more you have, the better. If you have 4 different pieces, great. When we develop 6, great. For the Lyme disease testing, Western blot, we have a bunch of them, all of that. So we take into account what may be working, what is required to have immunity. Those are conversations down the road. How many of these do you need to be immune? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? Do you need all 4? We don't know, because we don't have the retrospective studies yet. But let's start down that pathway. And by the way, what are you going to do to get healthy and stay healthy for the next one? So the kind of, we were talking a little bit earlier before the show. What do you do? What's the mechanism of health? Like what we do in our office. How do you get healthy and stay healthy for whatever comes down the pike, rather than developing just a specific immunity to a specific virus? Why don't you develop a global immunity to global viruses, global bugs?